Breakthrough.
You're watching Breakthrough News.
Breakthrough News. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me, Rania?
You were muted for a moment. I love that start. Now you're on. You're good. You're good. Say everything you said, but again.
It doesn't matter. What's really important is that this is the Freedom Side Live and that I am one of your co-hosts, Eugene Peltier, here alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, pleasure to be back with you.
It's a pleasure to be back with you, Eugene. It's been a while.
It's been a while. We were off last week, of course, because we had some exciting things happening. Myself and my colleague Kate Pritzker were at the inaugural event for the Union of Southern Service Workers, new union, for low-wage workers across the South here in the U.S. We're going to have some more content. We had some on Friday. We've got some more coming out imminently, I should say. I've even seen it, believe it or not, reporting from that very important event that took place in Columbia, South Carolina. But we are here. We are back, Rania.
We are back. And we have a great show today, right? Oh, wait, before we get into that.
Show. Well, yes. Before we get into that, we should, of course.
I forgot the order. This is, oh God, I'm really fumbling this. You take it.
There's no
take
order.
It before
There's
I make
no
it
order.
worse.
It's just, however it feels. It's sort of like a Fred Astaire situation. We just let the music carry us. But nonetheless, if you're watching on YouTube, this is a great moment to remind you, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell so you get the alerts. Like I said, we've got a lot of content coming out, including the great dispatches with Rania Khalek, a number of fantastic interviews with fantastic people. So if you are subscribed and get the alerts, you won't even have to go looking for it. It'll come looking for you, all the fantastic content here at Breakthrough News. And for however you want to do it, whether you call them, text them, send up a smoke signal, carrier pigeon, yell out the window, whatever you feel you need to do. Make sure that everyone who is following you knows that we are on live here on YouTube with the Freedom Side so that they can be following us because, as you say, Rania, we do have an excellent show. We're, of course, touching on many different issues from the rights of indigenous people here in the United States, the terrible ongoing conflict in the Great Lakes region of Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo, a really unbelievable story about the death penalty coming out of Missouri. We're going to be talking about COVID, which I'm sure is on everyone's mind here in the U.S. as they get ready to travel for the holidays. We're going to talk about COP27 and its discontents, mainly this issue of who should be paying and how much they are paying. And we're going to round the show out with Vijay Prashad talking about everything coming out of the recent G20 meeting and, whatever else we get to, as it were. But all sorts of great things, Rania, for everybody who is here.
Yeah, and then did we say the Patreon part?
I don't think we did. Sorry, I'm fixing
I'm
my
going to
mic.
do that.
My mistake.
No, that does sound so much better. Whoever
does
pointed
it?
that out, good. That was awesome. Yeah,
Yes.
it's wow.
Matt figured it out. The wizard.
Yeah. Now you sound like really like warm and close. Before it was very cold and distant. No, I'm just joking. Anyways, a quick reminder to people that if you want to support our show, which if you can, you absolutely should, go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and become a patron. And then, of course, you also can donate below on YouTube. And if you can, please do. It's what helps sustain our programming and helps us grow and continue to expand and bring you more of what I think is excellent content that we've already been bringing you, but really like just stepping it up a notch every time.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. And I'm glad you pointed that out, Rania. I mean, even I know people feel like their small donations don't often matter, but trust me, they do. People who follow me on Twitter know that if every single Twitter follower we have of Breakthrough News gave us $2 a month, that'd be $1.8 million a year. So you can see a lot of people giving $2 could really add up to something that could help us punch above our weight. So
we could have more Eugenes and Ranias that way.
I'm telling you. Just, listen, whether it's 25 cents, $1, $2, $100, or $1 million, we really appreciate it. So please donate if you can. But why don't we just jump right into it? Obviously, this week here in the United States is the holiday known as Thanksgiving. Some people refer to it as the National Day of Mourning because of its history that's deeply rooted in the genocide of Native Americans and how this country was formed. And there are a range of critical issues that are happening in front of the Supreme Court and elsewhere as it concerns the rights of Native people. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue the show here by Jean Roach, who's a Minicoujou Lakota, co-director of the International Leonard Peltier Defense Committee and AIM Grassroots, survivor of the 1975 shootout in Ogallala, South Dakota, an artist and a grandmother. Jean Roach, thank you so much for being back with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can. We got you.
Okay.
Jean, one of the things I wanted to start with here that I wish more people had known about is the Indian Child Welfare Act case that's in front of the Supreme Court. And, obviously this has deep implications for Native families. It deals very heavily with the issue of Native families being separated from one another and the rights that people have around that. So I guess maybe first question is just, can you talk to us a little bit about this issue of, the destruction and separation of Native families, this Indian and Child Welfare Act, and what they're trying to do by invalidating it at the Supreme Court?
Yeah, the Indian Child Welfare Act was established to keep our children within our families, within our tribes, basically. And I think it was initiated in 1978, but I'm not sure. But one of the positive things that's happened is that a lot of our children are no longer sent out, to other non-native people, which is like the third priority. What it actually does is makes a priority system of when children are taken into custody and they are supposed to be contacting like immediate blood relatives to take custody of these kids. The second priority would be native or indigenous families for the kids to go into, and trying to keep them in the area within the tribal system. But one of the things that going on is that it's being attacked in court because a family wants to challenge it with not even really understanding the implications, because they have a child that they want to keep in their family. So they're challenging the whole country about it. But one of the things that we do know is that so many of our children are being, especially here in South Dakota, this is what I'm talking about, is our children are placed into the Department of Social Services system. A lot of times they totally ignore, because we live in an area which is very racist to date. There's no doubt about it. Whatever you read is not necessarily the truth. We just had a hotel that denied access for Native people, putting it straight out there. We don't accept Indians. I mean, what year are we? This type of climate. And when our kids are taken, most of the time, the parents or whoever the guardians are never really charged with anything. It's just like throwing these kids into a system and we'll work on the charges, which never ever really come out. And in the meantime, you have these parents that are jumping through the systems, and a lot of times they do this, jump through the hoops to get their children back. But, it's just like a vicious cycle. And a lot of the stories end up with the children being adopted out, being abused, being sold into sex trafficking. I mean, it's just totally outrageous. We thought the boarding schools were bad, but now we have a new replacement, which is taking our children out. And one prime example that we have, which is recent, one of the guys on the east side by Sioux Falls, who is running for office, was a parent, and he was being a foster parent, and they got a Native American girl, which he pleaded guilty to for grooming. I mean, everybody else gets raped, straight up rape, but since he's non-native and within the system already, they silently put it as grooming, which means rape. Let's say it how it is.
Mm-hmm.
And he got away with it with no jail time. And when it's a native person, the same old double standards, a lot of times they don't even get out of jail. But you have this guy running around free, running for office, and has these charges. And the day of the election, he made a plea agreement. I think it was maybe a day or the day after. So he timed it. He was hoping he got in. Thank God he didn't. But these stories are like continual. So attacking ICWA is an attack on our sovereignty. And, a lot of things that we found out is that a lot of the attorneys that are representing the Brackeen, I think that's how you say their name, who are the people that are challenging the ICWA, are attorneys that were employed by DAPO. DAPO is the energy company that every tribe stood up to here, when Standing Rock happened. And those lawyers that are representing the people that are challenging ICWA are representatives of DAPO. So you put the story together. Every time we stop the pipeline, uh, they would lose, like, we'd have an action or whatever. They would lose millions of dollars because everything was closed down. This is in Standing Rock. And we feel like it's an actual revenge tactic for them losing all these millions.
Mm.
So it's very connected there.
That's
So our
just
children
incredible.
suffer. Yes.
No,
That came
yeah,
out.
no, those,
I can give you
go
some
ahead, go
names. I
ahead.
was just looking at that up. I did a little writing on this, the Congress. I can't even remember exactly, but there's been so much information into this. But it says the same law firm representing the Brackeens represented Kelsey Warren Energy Transfer.
Mm.
In 2016, indigenous resistance to the environmental ETP Dakota Access Pipeline cost the company $7.5 billion. Tribal nations hold 2% of all the land, but their total value of tribal fossil fuel resources is around 1.5 trillion. So it's not one thing after another, that they're always trying to break down our sovereignty. And that's one thing that's really hard because our whole lifestyle is based on protecting the earth. So it's all part of the circle of genocide. They attack our men, women, and children. So we view this as very serious. And yeah, when we find out this information about these lawyers, it's just like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's not one thing, it's
Yeah,
another on indigenous.
it is utterly shocking, and of course, the argument being made just completely turns the idea of racism on its head because you have white people claiming they're being discriminated against, and like you mentioned, this particular the lawyers who are doing this, they're Gibson Dunn is the law firm, and they're doing it pro bono. The law firm that you're talking about, which of course also represents this energy company that, like you mentioned, owns these major oil pipeline projects. So it really does seem incredibly punitive, like a punishment, on top of course, trying to remove more native sovereignty. But can you just briefly walk us through the history here? Because there's obviously a very real history of actually removing children, literally kidnapping children, native children from their homes. Can you talk about
Well,
that?
yeah, yeah. Well, it's not new to us. It started way back at first contact with the boarding school. And as people have noticed in the boarding school, as we've been saying for many years, that people were being killed there. Now we have evidence, the thousands of graves that are found unmarked of Native children starting in Canada. We're still assessing the boarding schools here in the U.S. side, but there are some. It's been going on for a very long time, where they actually just whip the Indian out of these children that didn't have a second language, and anytime they spoke their language, they were severely beaten. Now the children, now that I found out, and I've dealt directly with ICWA on twice with my grandchildren. So what they do is, these children that are coming back now, that have been taken despite ICWA, are coming back telling their stories of the families that have adopted them, how they were abused, and many of them were just taken by the families and then put into more like up to date boarding schools, but at the same time put on pills, antidepressants, and told that their family don't care for them. So they come back very angry back into our communities when they come back of age. And we have a couple cases where they just like hate their mothers because of this continual brainwashing that they suffer when they're within these families. So, and then when they turn 18, they don't want nothing more to do with them because they're not getting money for them no more. And it's real basic. The money that's given for a Native American child is different. It's equal to like taking care of a handicapped child. And that's the type of money they give to the foster parents. When they give their children back to blood relatives, they're getting no help. So the family has to prove, yeah, I have a bedroom for each child, which is not real in any big family. Not every family can afford to have a bedroom, but those type of stringent rules that they put on the parents to get their children back, and the ICWA has always saved a lot, as long as the tribes are the ones that have the actual power to use that law. It can't be used by parents, but the tribe is the one that takes the children back and assesses what happens. But it's just uh, shocking and really sickening what happens to our children. And any parent can relate to that. And it's just
Yeah.
we've had children that have been in there. It's just shocking the stuff they come back with and the details.
Yeah, I mean, it really just feels like to some degree as well that it's almost the criminalization of the results of the very oppression of indigenous people. I mean, the criminalization of poverty and all of the different subtext of it. Like, rather than address any of the root causes, it's just like we're just going to take people's kids away.
Oh yeah. And like I said, that's breaking down the indigenous or cultures and our belief systems. And a lot of this, like the different things that we're fighting now. I live here in the sacred Black Hills, and we have over 500 drilling sites. It's near like a fracking for gold. And you know what happened at the last gold rush. And we have a treaty that guarantees this land. And we've been fighting for recognition. And we always say, why are they going to all these other countries making treaties and not honoring the basic treaties that they made with the indigenous nations on this land? So when federal land goes up, the tribes have a say on the significance of ceremonial or cultural, and the companies have learned how to abuse that too. So our belief system, taking care of our children, which is the ultimate, our number one priorities is, our next generations coming, and we always try to prepare for the next 7 generations. So that just throws like a lot of, uh, I don't know what you call it, genocide, real genocide continued, and people can't see it sometimes, but it's real.
And so, can you tell people, like, for this, obviously, this case is very important. We have a very right wing Supreme Court with justices who have demonstrated that they don't respect Native rights with previous decisions that they've made and statements they've made. So, what is being done to organize against this? What can people do to get involved in pushing back against the hopefully will not be a right wing outcome to this case?
I think that of course, talking to their elected officials, and a lot of time they don't understand the real story. The story that we have is not. We're not given enough time to present ourselves, and the stereotypes that have been afflicted on our people for generations. This is still real. So they feel like they're doing us a favor by taking our children and brainwashing them into a whole nother culture. So yeah, there's a lot of things that we can do, and one of it is educating. And really, I mean, when we seen the children in cages, you know how many mothers up here were so outraged that what could we do? But just voice our opinions. I wanted to go drive down there and do something about that because that is not right.
Mm-hmm.
Our children are sacred, and we should continue to respect them as that. And the people that disrespect them, there needs to be some sort of a protection beyond ICWA is good, but still, the stuff that's being done to our children is just I don't know. You can't even talk about the things that the kids have, came back with the sexual. I mean, really. And the bottom line is that it it's a continuation of when the cavalry came. They treated our women the same way, or children. So we've been dealing with this for many generations, and I feel like people need to understand exactly what going beyond the stereotypes of indigenous people.
Mm-hmm. Well, Gene, as always, we really appreciate you being willing to join us here on the show and enlighten us to these critically important issues. And thanks again for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania, I think let's keep the movement moving on here. It's a tough story, a lot to be said there, and maybe we can swing back around. But packed show, tight show, and I want to go to another critically important issue that's happening on the other side of the world from the one we just talked about, but just as important, and that is the ongoing conflict in the Great Lakes region of Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we are very happy to be joined as we continue the show here by Akiomali Choma, who is a journalist covering the DRC and Central Africa more generally. Akiomali, thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you too. Thank you too for giving me the space and the speech for this show of this afternoon.
Well, we are very happy to give you the opportunity. And, I think, unfortunately, there are many people, I'm sure, who know almost nothing about this conflict, just that there's fighting in the DRC. So if you could maybe just give sort of a capsule view, a quick explanation of what this conflict between or happening in the DRC is really about.
Big thank you. Big thank you. I think the first thing we have to say here is that the conflict is more than 20 years old here in the east of Republic Democratic of Congo. And it's millions of people who were killed from that time until now. And the conflict is every day with new kind of rebellion. And the last, and which is now in all news, is the coming of M23, the new, the becoming movement, the becoming rebellion in the east of Congo, and which is at around 20 kilometers from Goma, the most and the important town in the east of Republic Democratic of Congo. It's a lot of women who were raped in that area. It's also a matter of many mineral and many things on the area of economy and politically, also on the geostrategy of the Great Lake African region.
I'm curious if you could talk about the role of Rwanda in this situation. Obviously, the DRC has been asserting itself against Rwanda quite publicly over what's been happening in the east of the country. So what's actually going on between these two countries? And is Rwanda supporting the M23 militia that the DRC is complaining about?
All evidence, there is no way to say that Rwanda is not supporting M23, because even report of MONUSCO, the mission of United Nations here in Congo, with images, they show that many soldiers who are fighting in Congo for the M23 are from Rwanda. Also, in many areas and in many region, it's only the Rwanda equipment which is used by M23. Also, those M23 are coming from area which called Sarambwe. It's near to Uganda, and another area which called Chanzu and Runyonyi, which are region near the border with Rwanda. So it means that there is no question about that, because the M23 is really supported by the Rwanda government, and the government show it. The NGOs locally show it. The United Nations mission here locally show it. But it's quite complicated for international community to say that in last time the General Secretary of United Nations say that he doesn't know where those great military equipment are coming from. It's quite complicated, but this is the situation, and there is no one who can say that M23 they can't come from anywhere and has a lot of raw material like they have. And as I told you, they are right now at around 20 kilometers from Goma, so it's quite complicated for people and for a civilian in the area. If I can show you, the first number is around 260,000 people who flying their house, and now they are living in refugee in IDPs camp in Kanyaruchinya and in Goma without any support, and in a non-woman situation. It's quite complicated.
No, it does seem quite dire for those who have been displaced. And I know now there's a lot of conversation about where the conflict goes from here. I mean, it seems like on the one hand, you know, in DRC, there's a big national mobilization and a desire to really, you know, take the fight to M23. But on the other hand, there are all these conversations happening with the East African community, with Angola, trying to find some way to you know, get a buffer force there and come to some negotiations. I mean, what is the situation like there now in terms of what the possible resolution could be? I mean, does it seem like there could be a deal in the short term to end the fighting, or does it seem as if, you know, this is going to be more of a fight to the finish?
It's quite complicated. It's quite complicated right now to know what is really going on and what will be the future, because the situation right now is worse. I think the first situation could be for the M23 to don't take Goma, because right now there are some troops of Kenya. There are also fact they say the Congolese army who is fighting with them at the last position, the last big position in the locality of Kibumba at 20 kilometers from here. So it's quite difficult right now for M23 to take control of Goma, because there is a lot of NGOs and a lot of IDPs here locally. And I think also MONUSCO, the United Mission here, will try its best to solve the problem and to don't put M23 coming in Goma. Right now, the government still say that the movement is a terrorist group. So it means that the government can't discuss now in the process of Nairobi, which is giving opportunity for all national movement group who are in Congo to have to put their aim down and to take care of the country and to give possibility of peace. Also, in another hand, there is another process of Luanda, which is a discussion between Congo and Rwanda, and that one is quite complicated because they have like 3 meetings between Tshisekedi, the president of DRC, and Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda. But right now the situation it's still the same, and it's going more worse, because from the last time when they met in Rwanda until now, the M23 take around, I can say, around 50 kilometer of area, and it's quite complicated to know what will really going on. But the only hope it can be the East African community with the force, or firstly, and secondly, with also the discussion with the former president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, who said that finally in the last discussion with him with the President Kagame of Rwanda, that Kagame, the President of Rwanda, said that the M23 should move and go to other areas and go to the beginners areas and try to make peace. But we are still see the situation how it's going on, because also in the last few months in Luanda there is also a kind of agreement like that, but until now the situation doesn't change, because also it was yesterday, but today I can say that the last news, like we have like 2 or 3 hours, no, true, 2 hours, the M23 take another locality in the way of the locality of Bambo in Rutshuru territory. So it's quite complicated, but this is the situation on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's very complicated on a number of different levels. And I mean, is it fair to say that what's really at stake here is, who is going to have control over, a critical region from the point of view of resources? I mean, what is Rwanda really after backing M23? I mean, is that what's really at the root of this?
Officially, Rwanda is saying that they are looking for FDLR, those former Interahamwe who are in Congo right now, and they are saying that it's a matter of security, but it's not the truth, because the Congo gave to Rwanda more than 10 years ago the opportunity in the operation which called Umoja Wetu. That operation give opportunity to Rwanda to don't say every time that they are coming to looking for those Interahamwe to come in Congo, and they came in Congo to fight with them and to finish with them. And when they decide that it finished, the Rwanda's force came to Rwanda, and after a few weeks, it was the M23 which came. So now I think that the problem is not really a matter of security, but the true problem is that area has a lot of mineral things, and people, and the Rwanda government, not Rwanda people, the Rwanda government right now, and even Uganda is trying to take control of those areas and to take to put those regions in a war situation as much as it can be, because a war situation help them to give some first material to send it to Rwanda and Uganda, and to say that it's a mineral from Rwanda and from Uganda. This is the important thing, and this is that why the war still. Also, it because Rwanda and Uganda are selling the view, the view and the analysis that if the Congo, the east of Congo, which has a lot of minerals, stay safely, it can be developed, and it will be quite complicated to use those material for international companies. So they are selling that idea, and some people on the international view are believing in that, and are saying, so we have to support, and this area should not have peace, which is not the truth, because in the last when the new president came in power, the first thing he discussed with all neighbors country, and he discussed about how to transfer gold from Congo to Rwanda. and to use it for the great African region development altogether. So it's quite complicated, and I think this can be the right issue.
Well, Akimale Shoma Shoma, journalist covering the DRC and Central Africa more broadly, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you too. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
No, thank you again. Yeah, terrible, terrible situation. Akimale is there. I should have said he was there in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They're in the frontline area. We'll keep covering this as it goes on. Obviously, very tough issue. We've been doing a lot. You go to my Twitter, I've been trying to follow it as well. And, there's a lot of local journalists, actually, believe it or not, in DRC that are on Twitter, on Instagram, putting out a lot. So, I encourage people to not only go look for it, but lift it up, because it is critical, quite frankly. Some say as many as 30 million people have died since 1997 when this conflict began. And unlike, say, Ukraine, not everyone is talking about it. There aren't Congolese flags in every single window, and that's not to take away from anyone. But come on.
You got that. I mean, it's just
to ask.
No, well, obviously it's not just, it's a couple of things. It's obviously racism. And it's also the fact that so many global North countries profit from just ongoing death in the Congo.
Coltan, which is the main mineral for your cell phones, one of the main minerals in this area, one of the main things that is being fought over, among many other things. But that's one that shows how deeply connected it is to all of us. Our smartphones are the source of this war. But we're going to turn to another critically important issue. That's the death penalty, particularly the case of Kevin Johnson in the state of Missouri, who is 8 days away, potentially, from being executed. But there are a number of people who are raising their voices to say that shouldn't happen, one of whom is Nimrod Chappell Jr., who's the president of the Missouri State Conference of the NAACP. Mr. Chappell, thank you so much for being with us. I think we...
Are you muted?
Us,
yeah, there's no sound coming out.
There we go. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Sorry. Yeah.
No problem at all. This is the era we live in. Well, we're about 8 days away, I believe, from Kevin Johnson potentially being executed by the state of Missouri. I mean, there's so many different issues that are here in front of us. But, maybe let's just start with, a capsule view of what's happening. Who is Kevin Johnson, and what are some of the basic issues in his case?
Absolutely. Well, Kevin Johnson is the face of racial disparities and injustice in our criminal system in Missouri. As you know, the NAACP issued a travel advisory in 2017 saying, hey, if you're a person of color, if you're black, and you're in the state of Missouri, there's good reason for you to be concerned. Part of that has to do with the way that we are policed on the highways, over stops, that when you get to court, you are receiving disproportionate outcomes from the rest of people in the state, and that there are a number of other disparities. The way this all comes to bear with Kevin Johnson is the simple fact that if you are black and if your victim is a white person, you are more likely to get the death penalty than anybody else. The only other thing that you can do is be poor. Kevin has all those factors going from him. He has a mother who, although she loved him, had extreme problems, and the way that she was able to express that was suppressed by addiction. And so from a very young age of 5, he was physically abused, sexually abused, unfortunately well documented until he was a teenager. And then it was this crime when he was just a person of 19 years out, when he lost his brother, that sparked his rage. And of course, no one is condemning the murder. But of course, at 19, I think many people would say that your brain is not fully developed and that you need extra consideration in that regard. He didn't get that.
I think this is so critical on so many levels, the things that you've laid out here. And the most notable one to me about the whole case is the issue of the disparities based on the race of the victim themselves. Because if I'm not mistaken here, the same prosecutor in different circumstances, when I believe the victim was black, actually argued for a lesser sentence than the death penalty than he did in the case of Kevin Johnson.
Well, and that's absolutely right. Bob McCullough, once a famed prosecutor, looked up by all the other prosecutors in the state, who has testified in favor of the death penalty, who has worked tirelessly to get the death penalty for our demographic, right? So if you're black and brown, he's worked overtime to ensure that you go to not just prison, but the death penalty. In this case, he went so far as to exclude all the black people from the jury. So the first time it was deadlocked. They couldn't decide whether or not they were going to give him death. He said probably not. And so they came back the second time, and he says, I know how to fix this. And it's just one example of how race has played the worst role that it can play in the criminal justice system. We've got to have prosecutors devoted to justice. And when they see it, they've got to act. It's not about convictions. But for Bob McCullough, that's all it was.
And what are the chances of this execution not going through?
Well, and I have to say, and I'm glad you asked, because we are prayerful, right? There is an appeal that's going up. Recently, a special prosecutor brought in by the court, because there was a conflict in the prosecutor's office in the county, who is not Bob McCullough, by the way. We have a very, very good prosecutor there. His name is Wesley Bell. You may well see him on a different stage, a regional or national stage. But we have an appeal that's going up right now, talking about the racial impact that Bob McCullough's decisions have had in this case. You know, sometimes you kind of guess, well, maybe they thought that this juror wasn't good, this one wasn't bad. There is a brief that is explicit that Bob McCullough intended to exclude all minorities from the jury. So that should work. It ought to work, right? We're going to go up to the Missouri Supreme Court and then to the United States Supreme Court if we have to. But then, too, there is an opportunity in Missouri for an extrajudicial panel to come together. It's by the governor. So we saw that happen with Derek Greitens, who was a governor at that time. He did that for Marcellus Williams. We were on our way down to witness his execution when we got word that panel would be allowed to review the case. That's what should happen here. No one's saying that Kevin Johnson should get, just saying don't murder Kevin Johnson to prove that murder is wrong.
You know, I think that's such a crucially important issue that you raised there, because I think we've seen pretty, clearly over the years that the death penalty doesn't have a deterrent effect, that it doesn't, make any major impact on sort of criminal justice. And it really does feel like it's almost as much about, this sense of revenge as it is to actually doing justice. And this feels like exactly the type of case that really allows us to consider some of those broader implications of like why we actually have a criminal legal system.
Mm.
On that just a little bit. In Missouri, a state that came in through the Missouri Compromise as a slave state, while Maine was allowed to con-slave state, that produced that said that black people weren't even people, not even full human beings. A state that in 1821 wanted to exclude blacks from the presence, just being in the state anyway, and then when we were allowed to be here, had to get registered with local county officials if you were. There are significant racial issues that are present in this case, and that's why Kevin Johnson is the new face of criminal or racial disparities in Missouri. If you've ever had a chance to read Walter Johnson's book, The Book of America, it starts off in St. Louis. He's a Missourian who understands that it's not just imperialism, but that the intersection with race that has put us where we are today. And it's literally killing us. We've got other folks like Durante Martin, like Tory Sanders, black men who have died in custody, not in custody, and can't get the killers prosecuted. But all of a sudden, it's very important that Kevin Johnson be executed so that some sense of redress be allowed to that family. They've got to make their peace with the Lord or whatever power they believe in. Killing Kevin is not going to change that.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a very active campaign, as you already have mentioned, and I think people watching this are probably wondering to some degree, if there's a way they can act. I mean, for those around the country who might want to raise their voices, where should they be looking for more information?
3 things that you can do. First, go to Missourians for All to the Death Penalty. They've got a fantastic website. It's wonderful. It'll provide all the information and up-to-date efforts to save Kevin's life. The second thing to do is let Governor Parsons know how much the meaning of life, that it has sanctity, that we don't want to live in a society that's racially charged and excludes people unnecessarily. Call 573-751-3222 and simply ask Governor Parsons to grant clemency to Johnson. Doesn't let him out of jail, life imprisonment, but it doesn't allow for his execution. And the third thing is do that by allowing your social medias, by telling your friends and neighbors, the people in your family, how important it is to take racism out of the criminal justice system. Because although Kevin Johnson is here in Missouri and is subject to execution in this state, there are Kevin Johnsons throughout the country, and we need to recognize a lynching for what it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I couldn't put it better than that. I think this is absolutely critical, absolutely crucial, and we really thank the NAACP in Missouri and around the country, and you, Mr. Nimrod Chappell Jr., who is the president of the Missouri State Conference of the NAACP, for joining us here on the show and helping people know about Kevin's case and what they can do.
Thank you. I love your show. Thanks for having me on and lifting Kevin Johnson. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's really unbelievable on so many levels, and we have
it's just crazy.
So,
it's crazy to me that even if you're going to take this position in the United States of having like a punitive criminal justice system where people are executed in an effort to, demonstrate or to make sure other people don't commit crimes. I mean, it doesn't actually work as a deterrent. That's one. But two, it's the fact that you would go through with this in a case like this when the details is so outrageous. And not that this, I don't the other issue too is there are people we know who are on death row that are also completely innocent. That goes along with the racial injustice system that we have. I think it's like the fact that any innocent person, first of all, has ever been executed is enough to not have this be a thing. But then when you hear the details of this case, it's not like there's, it's not like people on death row all are like a diverse array of people. The vast, it's like completely disproportionate poor and Black people. That's a situation. And it's just amazing to me that in the year 2022, we're still having this debate and this conversation, and people's lives are still being taken away, literally murdered as a result of this.
Yeah. No, I mean, it really is, it's an amazing situation. He sees, for people who don't understand, I mean, he sees his brother, basically, from his point of view, murdered by the police. His brother had a heart issue, and, he starts having a seizure, these things going on. There was some, police that were out involved, I think, trying to ticket his car. Anyway, long story short, they didn't really do much of anything. I mean, they did call for an EMT, but, I think the feeling of the family was that basically they didn't really do anything at all to try to save his life, and we know how that, can be. And certainly, I think most of what we've seen from the story, they did not go to all great lengths to save his life. And as, of course, was laid out by Mr. Chappell, these both boys brutally abused, and then he sees Kevin Johnson, one of these cops, subsequently, and, he snaps. But when you've been, the victim of all forms of physical, mental abuse in, out of foster homes, all sorts of violence, I mean, as the saying always goes, hurt people, and this is the perfect system of that. But the way they laid it out is they made it seem like he had laid an ambush for this cop, that it was a premeditated, cold-blooded murder. And as we just talked about in the segment, there are no exceptions, just railroad him and execute him. But then the same guy in an almost exactly similar case, because the victim was Black, not a cop, The same prosecutor says, oh, well, because of this guy's life circumstances, it should be a mitigating factor and he shouldn't get the death penalty. Now, I'm not saying that gentleman should have gotten the death penalty. I don't think he should have, but it just shows the racism that exists in the context of this. In every state in America, you are more likely to be sentenced to death if the victim is white. Everything else being equal, if you killed a white person, you are way more likely to go to death penalty. And you're even more likely if you're a black person that killed a white person. And this is totally it. And as someone who's looked at the death penalty for so many years, Rania, this is very often the case when you look at the death penalty. People with long histories of just brutal abuse. And when you read it, you think, well, no wonder XYZ happened. But they're always trying to sweep that under the rug and act like it doesn't matter and act like there's nothing to it. But in this case, there's not only something to it, but it's obvious that the prosecutor deliberately did not want to address this issue of mitigation because of racism. They wanted to throw someone under the bus as quickly as they possibly could for this murder that was designed to, as Robert Dunham, head of the Death Penalty Information Center, always says, it's an instrument of social control. It's designed to tell certain people what they can do, when they can do it, and how they can do it. And if you're a black guy who kills a white cop, they're going to send a message to you.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. That's America. That's the situation that this country is in, and it's like it doesn't change. I hope it can. But the fact that one of the first things I started covering as a journalist when I went into journalism was criminal injustice system, right? And like the various death penalty cases. And what you just said about white victims, if a white person is who was killed, it just shows you the value that we place on certain lives in this country, and continue to place on certain lives in this country. Not that we should be executing people left and right for everything, but it shows you a lot about what is considered punishable. And, on top of that, it's like just the lack of empathy. And that's what exists when it comes to people who are in the defendant position who are black, is there is a complete lack of empathy for what happened. This kid was the victim.
Yeah.
Like this kid was a victim. And now, as an adult, like he's being sentenced, he might be executed. It's just completely outrageous. And I don't understand. I almost have no words anymore. That the fact that I'm in a cynical mood tonight. I don't know what to say to.
No. Well, no, I hear you. The lack of cynicism is palpable on this one. I will say on one point is that the death penalty is rapidly falling out of use specifically because of these reasons. It's the least popular it's been since it's come back in the late 1970s, specifically because people have seen zero deterrent effect. By and large, the states with the highest murder rate also have the death penalty. So no deterrent effect there in any way, shape, or form. It's obviously racist. It's more expensive, actually, to sentence someone to death, and that's because of people. I say, how is that possible? But it's because there's so many appeals, because people don't want to be killed, and that costs money, and it often is a long process. So there's really no reason why you would do it. It doesn't actually do what it says it's supposed to do, and what it does do is extraordinarily racist, extraordinarily classist, and extraordinarily expensive. But we see these states like Missouri, Arkansas, Alabama, Arizona, Tennessee, the handful of states that are really responsible for basically almost every single death sentence. Now it's maybe about 12 states, and really not even 12 states. It's a handful of counties in those states. Like Nevada is one of these states, but almost every single death penalty case comes from Clark County. And again, this is an aside, but to give you a real interesting one, last year, it looked like Nevada had the votes in the state House and in the state Senate to abolish the death penalty. So the bill passes the House, it goes to the Senate, but the head of the sort of whatever they call it, Criminal Justice Committee, whatever it is in this state Senate, and the head of the Senate are both prosecutors in Clark County, where they seek almost all the death sentences. So they just made sure that it never came up for a hearing, much less never came up for a vote, and it just died in session despite almost certainly having the votes to pass. So it gives you a sense of how politics is being played. But the places like that, these so-called outlier counties, all they go to the greatest lengths they possibly can. You've got Alabama trying to suffocate people with nitrogen poisoning. You got Arizona rehabbing their gas chamber using the same gas that the Nazis used in the Holocaust. You've got, electric chairs potentially being brought back. You've got lethal injections with midazolam, which is called the chemical equivalent of a burning at the stake. A chemical equivalent of the burning at a stake.
What?
They say.
I did that one. I did not know about that one. I did not know about.
Yep, and it's the number one drug now used in these lethal injections. So, and even in a quote unquote regular lethal injection, which is supposed to be painless, it's now come out by a long study that's been done of many, many executions going back to the 80s. That when they look at the lungs of the people who were executed, it seems almost certainly that the lungs were filling with fluid while they were paralyzed but awake, which means that anyone with a lethal injection, it was like they were drowning to death. But they couldn't move, they couldn't cry out, they couldn't do anything. So even though it was seen like, oh, they went peacefully, in fact, they went in a state of complete terror, just like everyone who dies while drowning. So gives you a sense of the handful of places that want to keep doing this.
It's torture.
It's about.
It's torture. That's death by torture.
And that's why many countries have outlawed it, quite frankly, because it is. It's honestly, it's hard to even comprehend how absurd the conversation is when you drill down on it. So yeah, Kevin Johnson, for people who are more curious, go to madpmo.org. That's madpmo.org. That's Missourians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. And they have certainly all the information about his case. And if you read it and you feel that you want to do something, they've got the information there for that too, if you so desire, and also some of the other campaigns that they are working on around the death penalty in Missouri. So madpmo.org.
I mean, not to make it sound so morbid, but our entire system in the U.S. is just like, it almost like worships death, even if it doesn't mean to, although that's what at the end of the day, it's like a capitalism issue. But it does feel like a sort of worship of death, the sense of like, and I mean, this is eventually going to kind of segue into our next segment, but in the sense of just everything in our country, like we've talked about this before, Eugene, about, first of all, we have the death penalty in all these states. And you actually, like you mentioned, you have people in charge of certain counties who are just like these conservative racists who want to keep this, corporal punishment type people who just like want to keep this archaic system intact. And it's a system that literally celebrates killing people. Mm-hmm. And then our system kills people in so many other ways. Like we just don't have access to free healthcare. So many people die as a result of that, or their healthcare is unaffordable, or we have a system that doesn't do enough preventative care. And then that way you just end up with like a system that deals with people when they're already so sick that it's going to cost them so much and maybe they won't even make it, and on and on and on. And it's stunning to me. We have a system that claims to be like, pro-life. We make abortion illegal, but then we don't protect people after they've been born. We don't help mothers after their children have been born. In fact, in some cases, some mothers can't afford to pay or go to proper hospitals to do their prenatal care to make sure that their birth goes well. And so we have this like high maternal death rate in the US, I think the highest of any developed country, if I'm not mistaken. And just like childhood poverty and childhood hunger. And I mean, all of these things are connected and they all go back to a similar root cause. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they certainly do. I mean, even just the phrase childhood poverty and childhood hunger is like, damn, like really, we're in the richest country on earth and we're really about to let children go hungry and live in poverty? Like you'd think that would be one thing people could agree on, but in fact, it is not. And we saw almost all of the most effective measures brought in to address some of these issues during the pandemic all just, time out because Congress could not agree, both Democrats and Republicans could not agree on basic things like, paid family leave, paid sick days, universal child care, universal pre-K, even the child tax credit. I thought Republicans loved tax credits, but couldn't get that one together. So really it's an engineered problem. And that's when I feel like there's so many problems that exist in the United States. I think, as you say, they talk about wars of choice. Well, this is sort of like a war of choice that they're not waging. You could have a war against poverty. You could have a war against homelessness. You could have a war against hunger, but they choose not to. But I think that is a good segue into some of the deeper issues surrounding COVID, the COVID pandemic, the ongoing issues from it. And we are very, very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Dr. Bernard Ashby, who's a vascular cardiologist, an associate professor at Florida International University, FIU. What's up? And the Florida lead with the Committee to Protect Healthcare. Dr. Ashby, thank you so much for being with us.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here.
Well, I guess my first question, I hate to have to even ask this in a way, but I think, a lot of people are wondering is the pandemic over? It seems like there's so many different kind of competing messages coming from all different quarters about how serious COVID continues to be, how serious people should take it. And here we are in a week where many, many people are going to be traveling. So I guess that's just where I want to start is how serious is it now and how serious should people be taking it?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to elaborate a little bit more about the public health circumstances in the U.S. and worldwide. So the issue with the pandemic, whether it's here or not here, a big issue with that is regarding the definition. I mean, if you go to the WHO, you go to the CDC, it's a bit of a moving target in terms of what does a pandemic mean. So just in general, a pandemic should mean any disease that occurs over the world, so meaning multiple populations, multiple geographical areas, and what qualifies as a pandemic is also a moving target, but generally speaking, it's a disease that's spread person to person. And, the definition, again, is a moving target, so, everybody has their own interpretation. What I can tell you is that COVID-19 is still here. And as I said from the beginning of the disease, when we first beginning of the virus, when we first characterized it, is that it's going to be here for the rest of our lives. And the way I would frame it is we're kind of pretty much in the subacute phase of the pandemic. We went through the acute phase, now we're in the subacute phase, and eventually we'll reach the chronic phase.
So when you hear things like, the Biden remarking that the pandemic's over, we've obviously had the Senate vote to end the COVID-19 emergency declaration. And really, aside from some campaigns to try to encourage people to get the newer, updated vaccine, there's not really anything being done to try to contain it. So, when you see that from public officials, it's really giving off the impression that everything's normal. But is everything normal? Like, how should there still be mitigation efforts? If so, what would they look like? Or is it true we just have to learn to live with it and get over it?
So everything is not normal, but this is kind of our new normal. So meaning that the virus is not going to go anywhere. So I think the way I would frame the question is, what are we going to do moving forward? So we need to start talking about 10, 20 years down the road because, again, the virus is not going anywhere. So now that we're no longer in the acute phase, meaning that most of the world, the vast majority of the world has some immunity, either through vaccination or the previous exposure, we're no longer in that acute phase. However, people are still dying, and disproportionately, people who don't have the resources to mitigate or treat the virus are the ones dying by and large. And as we all know, the world is structured in a certain way that it doesn't care about individuals who don't have power or resources and yada, yada. I could get carried off on a long tangent there. But we need to start thinking about, how do we exist in this new normal, kind of like with HIV. And as we learned from HIV is that the public health infrastructure in the US and worldwide failed millions of people. There were a lot of deaths, and there continue to be a lot of deaths related to HIV. And now we're seeing the same thing with COVID-19. And the question is, what do we do about it? And, it's related to our system. Our system is designed in a way that it's all about making profits. It is not about mitigating or decreasing death and improving quality of life. Profit is a number one motive. And as a result, the priorities related to the public that could actually improve the health and wellness of the public come secondary to the profit motives.
Well, I'm actually really glad you raised that because I think some of us felt maybe if nothing else had been revealed by the COVID-19 pandemic, that certainly this had revealed the just massive gaping holes quote unquote healthcare system, because it is all kind of based on who can afford to pay and how much you can afford to pay. And a lot of it is sort of, kind of crisis management more than I would say healthcare. So, I mean, talk about that a little bit more if you could. I mean, what for you are some of the glaring things that have been revealed by this that are problems that we could resolve if we didn't have this kind of for-profit system?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Eugene. So during the pandemic, a whole lot of people made a bag. For those who don't know, some people made a lot of money during the pandemic. And you cannot view the healthcare system as a monolith, meaning that there's different interests, sometimes competing interests within healthcare, but everybody's trying to make a bag. So you have the healthcare professionals, i.e. the doctors, you have the actual hospitals, you have the insurance system, and you have the pharmaceutical industry. Out of all of those, I mean, the pharmaceutical industry made the biggest bag, but again, everybody made a bag. And what we saw is that our current infrastructure is a heterogeneous mix of different groups and institutions, such as hospitals and medical ecosystems, and decentralized EHRs, electronic health records, and obviously a patchwork of coverage, and a huge portion of our population that is not engaged with the healthcare system in any meaningful way. And so what we had was a reactionary take that exposed a lot of the deficiencies within our healthcare system. One example, just to kind of bring it home, was in New York City, where we saw a huge amount of deaths early on in the pandemic, but it was located regionally in Brooklyn and in the Bronx and in poor and Black and brown areas, whereas Manhattan and other more affluent areas had actually more than enough hospital capacity. But because of the way the contracts were drawn up with regards to the ambulance and emergency services, you had a 20-to-1 nursing ratio in Brooklyn, and you had empty rooms in Manhattan. And so again, the business of medicine often, all the damn time, interferes with the outcomes and the health and wellness of the population. So that was just one glaring example where people were allowed to die when you could have simply transferred them to another hospital. But the business superseded the people.
And of course, now we know that US health insurance prices have gone up something like 30% over the past year. It seems like every year they go up a certain percentage because there's no price caps on these things, which of course makes all of this care more out of reach for people who can't afford it. And it's also striking right now. I mean, this is not necessarily about COVID, but it's tangentially related. You have this rise of RSV, which is this childhood respiratory virus, or at least it mostly occurs in children, that is causing there to be a shortage of hospital beds for children. But a lot of what is being left out of that story is that there's a lack of hospital beds as well, because they've literally just been removed from so many hospitals. And I remember specifically with the US, before, when COVID was first just getting started, there was a lot of news agencies like kind of comparing and contrasting how many beds per capita there are in the US versus other countries. And one of the reasons there were so few in the US is because like 10 years ago, there was this like federal effort to get hospitals to reduce the numbers of beds because it was considered inefficient to have so many empty beds in your hospital. You always want to be between like 80 to 90% capacity or something silly and neoliberal like that. And I don't know, I just kind of threw out a bunch of stuff there. But what are your thoughts on how all of that plays out in the kind of situation that we're in the United States? I mean, it just seems like as a country, we're in a terrible position to continue to deal with this on a long-term basis because of this horrible profit-driven system that we have that just like shakes people down and gets rid of hospital beds for profit.
Yeah, I think you put a nice little bow at the end of your question/statement. I mean, at the end of the day, this is all about getting the bag. That's it. And all of the propaganda or the fluff that they use on commercials and advertising about improving healthcare and all that stuff is just a bunch of BS. Anyone that works in the hospital knows that the hospital administrators, they value how much you generate in terms of revenue as opposed to your patient outcome. They don't even care about that. And they only care about it to the extent that they won't get dinged by any regulatory agency, mainly CMS. And so that's what you see. So the example that you use regarding the bed capacities, it's bad business to have empty beds. So obviously you want to reduce that. But more importantly, again, the profit motive and the structure of our healthcare system is just all about making money in your individual business or silo, where we could have easily alleviated this issue with RSV beds and pediatrics with coordination. If we had some kind of coordination, some kind of system where we could, improve the capacity throughout the country and in particular regions with some coordination, we just don't even do that. So again, you'll have a buildup of patients in one hospital. You have another hospital in a different area that is below capacity, but there's no communication between the two, or at least it is a piecemeal or a reactionary measure as opposed to a coordinated, proactive measure. So our system is trash. It's trash by design. Everyone who gets into the market, they're trying to make money, and so that's their primary motive. And again, the public health implications we are devastating to our population. And as a cardiologist, knowing that heart disease in particular is the number one cause of death, still is higher than COVID-19 deaths, and it's been that way for decades. The fact that we're still ignoring that is it's basically pisses me off. Let me just frame it that way, because it's so easily preventable, and we could have put a fraction of the resources that we did into COVID-19 into preventing heart disease and gotten a better outcome. But the point is, I'm not saying which one is worse. I'm just saying the money that we're spending, we're not getting a return on our investment as a nation and as individuals and taxpayers. It's a complete waste. And most of that money is getting captured by these people who own these businesses and who are involved in the nonprofit side of healthcare, because I can't really tell the difference between a for-profit and non-for-profit, because all of them trying to get the bag. Just a matter of how that money's bust down at the end of the day. But at the end of the day, we have the same issues across the board. And again, the reason why the U.S. does so poorly in terms of life expectancy and chronic disease is because of a system that is primarily incentivized to make money.
I mean, so many important points there. I mean, thinking about heart disease, I was thinking about diabetes. It's almost like there's like a blame the victim effect too. And it's like, well, if they just hadn't had so many sugary drinks, then it all would have been fine. And there's no real conversation about preventative health care. But, what kind of healthcare system do we need to address this? Because it does feel that there's a huge gap between what we know how to stop and what we're actually stopping.
Well, we don't need to recreate the wheel. There's other systems out there. We see the system in Cuba with relatively low resources and their outcomes compared to the U.S. It's day and night what they're getting for every dollar that they spend. You could look at past examples, like even in Grenada after the revolution there under Maurice Bishop, and how they went about designing their healthcare system. And what I loved about that is that they actually went to the population and ask them, what do they want? What do they need? How can we help you? And then the system was designed with them in mind, as opposed to a top-down system the way it's designed here with, again, a primary profit incentive. But, we just have to change our incentives. I mean, it doesn't take much. The entire Western world does the same thing, meaning that they provide healthcare to their population, and it's not privatized. But the U.S. unfortunately refuses to pivot from that, primarily because of the stakeholders. There's a lot of people who are making trillions in healthcare, and they ain't gonna let that happen. And so any little increment that of progress that we can in actually dismantling the system, they fight back tooth and nail. We saw that in the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, where they fought tooth and nail to get rid of the public health option. And you see that around the U.S., where we have these public option debates that are ongoing. The public option in of itself is not a solution, but they know and we know that that's the stepping stone to creating some kind of universal health care for the population, where you can actually decrease costs and improve outcomes. And what I get frustrated with is with my medical professional counterparts who, they think that somehow we'll have a communist healthcare system. And, obviously, besides the fact they don't understand what they're saying, the point is that our lives would be better if we were able to submit a claim to Medicare as opposed to submitting it to a private insurance company. Our entire life would be better, meaning that we don't have to deal with prior authorizations and eligibility and all that stuff that we deal with on the private market. We'll just deal with the Medicare system because it's much easier for us because we know what the price is going to be or the reimbursement is going to be, and we submit our claim and our claim gets paid. It's pretty simple, but there's a lot of politics around going to a single payer system, which means just having one entity as opposed to a million different entities that we got to submit our bills to be able to get compensated for the care that we provide. And it's unfortunate. I mean, the politics and the business around healthcare is a thorny issue, a lot of third rails, and no one wants to touch it. But at the end of the day, the more people would be alive today, less people would be dead, less people would be suffering, more people would be working. Our country would be spending less money, taxpayer money on healthcare if we simply removed all of these middlemen who are focused on making a bag.
Right.
Unfortunately. So that's my long rambling way to say that we need to go to a single payer system.
No, it's so true. It's so true. And, it's interesting you mentioned Cuba because Cuba is obviously a country that is definitely lacking in resources because it's like under this horrible U.S. blockade. But at the same time, I had the chance to visit Cuba earlier this year. And one of the best things about being there was just seeing how its healthcare system functions. Because despite the fact that it's an impoverished country, again, as the result of this isolationist blockade that the U.S. has placed on it, or isolating blockade, I should say, it's able to have these amazing health outcomes because it's so focused on preventative care and because preventative care is not expensive to implement across the board because it actually prevents greater illnesses, prevents the spending of even more money and more difficult procedures, and keeps people from dying in childbirth and, dying from things that are preventable when they're elderly and just all kinds of things. And it was incredible to see that. And then you go back to the US and it's like the opposite in the supposed richest country in the world. But, I wanted to ask you, since we are coming up on Thanksgiving this week, and then of course the, Christmas and New Year's. So we've got all these holidays, Hanukkah, people are gathering together with family and friends. How should we approach it, as we go into the holiday season, planning on sometimes seeing our grandparents? I mean, do we still need to be approaching this like we did back in 2020? And I know it sucks in the US to have to do everything on such an individual basis, but I guess my question is, how can people minimize the risk as they try to enjoy the holidays?
So, yeah, great question. And it goes back to my point about, hold on, sorry, I had a little snafu with my computer here. Yeah, it goes back to my original point about saying, if not now, then when? I mean, the virus isn't going anywhere. So we got to kind of start figuring out how to exist, understanding the political dynamics and the reality of the virus. And so what I've been doing in my practice is really identifying my high-risk patients, which is the vast majority of my patients, and coming up with a plan. And so all of them have a plan in place, meaning a rapid treatment strategy, in addition to being fully vaccinated, where they have tests at home and we have, early access to things like Paxlovid to treat the virus, in addition to giving them information like, if you can go outside, go outside. If you can open your windows, open your windows. And also ensuring that the family members that come to your house are acting responsibly, meaning that they can either test themselves prior or at least making sure that they're adequately vaccinated and protected. So unfortunately, those are kind of like public/private measures. But if we had a good public health system, good public health infrastructure with great communication, we could save lives easily. I mean, it doesn't take anything in terms of additional resources. It just takes some kind of comprehensive approach that's proactive rather than reactive. And, we're years into the pandemic and still we're being reactive and waiting for the next, variant to come by, and then we panic again. It's only a matter of time before that happens, and it's very frustrating. And so, um, this is our new norm, and you're gonna be asking me the same question in 2023 Thanksgiving, and I'm gonna get frustrated. But at some point, we need to learn how to live with the virus, because as much as we would like to wish it away, it is the most infectious thing that we've seen in our lifetime. And there's animal reservoirs, and there's just no feasible way to get rid of it unless you somehow protect the host permanently. So, and that's something that we could work on. But as of right now, this is a new reality, and we have to plan accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Well, something for people to think about as the political situation rolls on, about the changes we can make, absolutely critical. And I'm fully in agreement with you. If not now, then when? And if not us, then who? Because obviously this it cannot happen again. Well, Dr. Bernard Ashby at BAshbyMD on Twitter, BAshbyMD. I can highly encourage everyone to follow you. I find it deeply edifying myself, but I really appreciate you being with us here, Dr. Ashby. Hope to have you back as we move on here, but helping sort through all these complicated issues.
I appreciate y'all. Y'all take care.
Mm-hmm, you too. I mean, you hit the nail on the head, Rania. I mean, when money is more important than health, how can you really be shocked that it doesn't work out the way you want it to? I mean, it's people. A friend of mine, I think I might have told you this story before, and you might hate it, but I don't know if the listeners have. A friend of mine who lives in Austria, who loves Grey's Anatomy, and she was telling me there's all these fans of Grey's Anatomy in Austria amongst her friend group, and I say, well, what do they say about healthcare in the U.S.? And she's like, everyone says, man, if I ever go visit the U.S., I just really hope I never get sick. And it's just and obviously those crazy hospital shows are like not. I mean, they always have their obligatory episode show how bad it is, but it's not like it's the carnage of the day in and the day out. So if that's the image it gives off to people in other advanced countries, like no matter what you do, never get sick in the United States, I think that should tell you something. That's my view of it.
Yeah, totally. I'm with you on that.
Yes. Well, thankfully, if we weren't on the same page, we'd be in trouble there.
I'd be like, actually, no, get sick in the U.S. Get sick and just see what happens.
Listen, even if you're rich, it might not work out that well for you. So just be careful.
True. That's true.
We're going to turn to another critically important issue, one that also actually impacts our lives heavily. That's climate change, since none of us can live if the conditions on the planet don't allow it. And of course, we're coming off of COP27, a lot to discuss there. The big focus, of course, being, loss and damage, climate finance, who's responsible, who's going to pay. So we are very, very happy to be joined for this conversation by Brandon Wu, who is the Director of Policies and Campaigns for ActionAid USA. Brandon, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thanks for having me again. Always a pleasure.
Well, the pleasure is always ours, and I feel we're in your wheelhouse to some degree with this COP27. I felt somewhat prepared reading the news because we've had so many conversations, but obviously the big theme here was loss and damage, fair shares, payments. There was a sort of a deal that came at the end. There's a lot to get into here, but maybe just bottom line, back of the envelope. I mean, Are you encouraged at least by the tenor and the tone of the conversation? And what do you feel in terms of some of the commitments that were made at COP27 of if it's moving us forward at the right pace?
So I'll start with this, which is to say I have never left a COP in the last 10 years feeling positively. When the Paris Agreement was agreed in 2015, that was like, the big step forward for climate multilateralism. And at the end of 2015, when the Paris Agreement was approved, I was pissed, right? I was angry that agreement happened with so little regard for the needs of people in the global South, with key issues like equity and finance just glossed over. It felt to me like a hijacking of the UN Convention on Climate Change by rich countries. And actually, so in contrast, after this COP, I was feeling pretty good. And that's not because that what was agreed at this COP, is everything that we need. By no means is that true. What we got is an empty bucket, right? We have an agreement that we're going to create a fund for loss and damage, which means an agreement that rich countries are going to start paying the costs of climate damages in the global south. We've never had that before. We didn't think we were going to get that. As recent as 2 months ago, John Kerry was sitting in New York making sort of disparaging comments about the idea of loss and damage finance. And so the reason I was feeling positive is because it was our movements and the unity of the G77 bloc of developing countries who really held firm and put an enormous amount of pressure on rich countries, in particular the US, to get them to actually shift their position. That's never happened before. The US has always been the most vehement blocker of any progress on loss and damage negotiations. And the fact that we managed to move them, that in and of itself gives me more hope than I've had for a while. Now, again, we don't have any money in this thing yet. We don't actually know how it's going to work. There's a process to figure that out over the next year. So basically what we did is we gave ourselves a whole hell of a lot more work to do over the next year and a whole lot more fights to have. But the fact that we are able to have those fights is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Definitely that you have some positive and negative things to say here. But at the same time, when we talk about the different global leaders coming together to talk about climate change, like what just happened, there's also the issue of the word's not climate inequality, but in a way, right? Like who's contributed the most to climate change, the global north versus who's suffering a lot more of the consequences, which is of course the global south, and is also in a tougher situation to actually deal with it because these are more impoverished countries. So was this a topic of conversation? Because this has always been an issue that, global north countries play lip service to, but then, they'll oftentimes use their power to like shut down any actual legitimate talk of like climate reparations and things like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was a huge part of the discussion. So one of the negotiations about this loss and damage fund was who's going to pay into it, right? And it was a priority for the EU and the US to say, it can't just be us. Look at China. Isn't China a big problem too? Shouldn't China be paying in? So that there's this language about we need to expand the donor base, which means get other countries to pay because the global north hasn't been meeting their obligations, right? So thankfully, we came away with, with some language that says it basically mirrors what we already have in the Paris Agreement, which is that the responsibility really lies with developed countries, which is the US, the EU, Australia, Japan, et cetera, et cetera. Other countries can contribute on a voluntary basis. China actually said in the first week of negotiations that they might be willing to contribute money for other countries for loss and damage. But the responsibility lies with those historically industrialized countries in the global north that haven't lived up to their obligations. Another thing on this is that you might have seen that there was this push from particularly the European Union, but also the United States about keeping language in the agreement about the goal of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees or less, right? And they were saying, we have to keep 1.5 alive, blah, blah, blah. It's unbelievable to me, the hypocrisy that it takes for the global north countries to be delivering that message. And what it was an attempt to sort of create a narrative that they could use coming out of this in case they couldn't agree to a loss and damage fund. It was going to look really bad for the global north and they needed an out. And so they were going to say, but it was the developing countries like the Chinas and Indias of the world who couldn't agree to keep 1.5 alive. That whole thing was a sham. I mean, they put 1.5 in there without any mention of equity and of fair shares. And the thing about 1.5, so they wanted to say, all countries need to align their national climate plans to a 1.5 degree pathway. Now, whether or not a country's plans are aligned with 1.5 depends on what other countries are doing, right? And so if the US and the EU and Australia and Japan aren't doing their fair share, that burden gets shifted to the global south. And they know that, right? And they know that historically the rich countries have never done their fair share. And so this is just shifting the burden onto the poor, right? But the rich countries are setting up that narrative, right? It's we're in favor of ambition. We want climate action. And meanwhile, the US just opened a new LNG terminal in the Gulf South, right? Like we have the biggest fossil fuel expansion plans in oil and gas of any country in the world. It's pure hypocrisy. And they wanted to distract from the fact that they're not meeting their obligations by pointing to some, fake thing, 1.5 in a UN document and claiming that they were the champions of climate action. So all of this stuff is going on to try to paper over the fact that the rich world has just not lived up to their obligations on any of this, on reducing emissions, on providing finance, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's such a good point because I think, it speaks to one of the critical factors of the world, right, which is uneven and combined development. Like, it's probably a lot easier for America to make a huge shift into public transportation and drastically reduce emissions than for, a country like, most of sub-Saharan African countries where there's so much poverty. I mean, forget planes, trains, and automobiles. I mean, people are still trying to figure out how they can get a bike for themselves, much less anything else. And that it almost seems that that is a big part of that conversation too, is the state at which certain societies are developed to has a huge impact in their capacities. Like, what does it mean for Mali to, from my point of view, to align their goals? I mean, they already don't emit almost anything. So it's like, in a way, what can they do? And it feels like that often gets left out of the understanding, I think, of how this thing is messaged.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about, when we're thinking about different countries' fair shares of climate action, we talk a lot about historical responsibility, right? Like which countries have emitted the most climate pollution since the Industrial Revolution. But there's another side to that calculation of fair shares, which is capacity, right? And those two things are deeply linked. The countries that have emitted the most since the Industrial Revolution have used those emissions to build their economies, right? And so if you're just looking at emissions alone, China is the second largest historical emitter, right? But once you bring capacity in there, because China just started developing much later than the Western world, their capacity is much lower. There's still a lot of development challenges in China. There's a lot of poverty in China. When you take that into account, their fair share of climate action is a lot less than you might otherwise think if you're just thinking, oh, it's a huge economy. They're the second biggest historical emitter in the world. Whereas if you look at the U.S., because we built this massive engine of economic growth on the backs of destroying the planet, our fair share, by the calculations of a big civil society collective that my organization is part of, is 39% of the world's climate action. So almost 40% of the responsibility for climate action falls on the United States. And China's way less, despite the fact that they're a larger current emitter than the U.S. right now.
Yeah, that raises the question of, okay, so we know what the U.S. is doing to destroy the climate, which is a whole lot and has been doing to destroy the climate. Is the U.S. doing anything? I imagine the U.S. is not doing enough, but I'll leave that to you to answer. Is the U.S. doing anything to address it at all?
I mean, we're not doing nothing.
Okay.
I think the Biden administration came into COP27 trying to take a victory lap for the Inflation Reduction Act, right? Saying, look, this is the most ambitious climate bill we've ever passed domestically. That's true. That's also a very low bar, right? And I can tell you the rest of the world was not buying it, right? They were not buying the fact that the U.S. has something to celebrate just because we passed this law a few months ago. They were saying, well, yeah, but look, that's less than a quarter of your fair share. What are you providing in terms of climate finance to the rest of the world? By our calculation, using the most conservative estimation of monetary needs in developing countries for climate action, so across mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, that U.S. fair share of 40% would be about $1.6 trillion over the next 10 years. What's been pledged by the Biden administration is $11 billion, and they're not anywhere close to meeting that. And so no, like we're not doing nothing. We are giving small amounts of climate finance. We're doing the things that are in the Inflation Reduction Act, or at least we'll be trying to. But that's all that stuff is a drop in the bucket. We need to be thinking on a whole different scale here.
No, I think that's a very good point. It reminds me a lot of humanitarian aid too, as the U.S. will say, well, we're the biggest donor to whatever the country may be. And like they are, in fact, the biggest donor, but there's still these huge shortfalls. And I feel that obviously it's sort of the scale of the problem determines everything. But to return to a slight note of hopefulness, though, I mean, I do agree with you at the outset that it was encouraging to see, the G77 nations, obviously the mass movements, which weren't able to show themselves at the same numbers given the location of the COP. But I mean, even to see some of these people who, I have to be honest with you, I'm not even sure they do care that much about the climate from some of these countries, but still speak so strongly to the need to address something that it did feel that as much as there is left to go, it's not as if everyone who's been talking about the importance of doing something about climate change has been purely beating their heads against the wall. And that to some degree, even just the symbolic recognition of some of these points, even if it's just a narrative victory, that actually matters, because that's certainly how people are going to receive it. I mean, I'm sure you can remember this, Brandon. I can remember it very well. When, climate change was like a joke, it's like, oh, global warming, hippies, blah, blah, blah. And so no one took it seriously. But now it feels at the very least that level of seriousness is seeping further and further into our public consciousness of what's happening.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the challenge is that it's not happening fast enough. I think with other in other contexts, we feel like we reassure ourselves thinking, it takes time to build power. It takes time to build movements. We got to do it right. We need to be like the process is as important as the outcome in a lot of ways. The challenge with climate is that we're just out of time. And so how do we do it right with good process in a way that also meets the urgency? And to me, I just think that this, like what happened in Egypt is a good example of one of the ways that I, managed to hold hope, which is that things can change really fast. There are moments, there will be moments that we can take advantage of to change the status quo really radically and really quickly. I'm not saying that what happened in Egypt was radical, but it was unexpected and it happened quickly. And part of the reason it happened is because we were ready for the moment. We had been building up to this for years and years through organizing among civil society in both the global north and the global south, putting pressure on those developing country negotiators, because you're right. None of these governments are our friends, none of them represent frontline communities or everyday people. But we put pressure on those developing country negotiators, or I should say our colleagues in the global south did, to make sure that they didn't just cave to pressure from the US and the EU, because they knew they would be held accountable. And so it took a lot of work, but there was a moment and we took advantage of it. And that's what we have to be working towards. We have to believe that there's going to be a moment in the near future where everything's going to change. And we just have to be ready for it. I feel like the 2008 financial crisis was a great example. That was the moment to really challenge global capitalism, and we just weren't ready for it as a movement. And the next time something like that happens for climate, we got to be ready for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you this before we let you go on exactly that point. I mean, that also felt like another element looking at, the civil society groups that were there in Egypt to the extent they could be there, that is important is, the rhetoric around capitalism, of understanding how we got here, of understanding how profit comes in, the importance of leadership coming from oppressed communities. I mean, you saw all these things on display. Obviously, we could always be doing more, but that also feels big too, that the quote unquote climate justice movement doesn't look the same way it did even, 5 or 6 years ago in terms of who's leading, what the priorities are, and what the discourse is.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the leadership of movements from the global south among the sort of global networks of civil society has grown exponentially in the last few years. And it used to be that civil society, sort of the environmental NGOs in this space, were almost acting as mouthpieces for the U.S. and the EU. Right? They were treating climate change as a purely environmental issue, divorced from geopolitics and divorced from, colonialism and the history of exploitation of the global south. And that has changed significantly. There's a lot more of that critique that's right out there in the open. Even if you look at the coverage of the loss and damage issue in the US press, like the New York Times articles were talking about historical responsibility. They weren't talking about, or at least they weren't exclusively talking about, China as the biggest current emitter. They were talking about historical responsibility. And that's a credit, I think, to our movements, including in the US, right? Framing this in the right way, framing this in the context of global justice. I definitely take hope from that. And, we'll see. Lula showed up to COP27 and made an offer to host COP in a few years in Brazil. We had the Colombian government under Petro giving much more progressive statements than they've ever given. I think there are reasons to hope. There are deep structural critiques of global capitalism that are coming to the surface because we it's becoming more and more clear we can't avoid that. That is the driver of this problem, and we have to challenge it.
Mia Motley for global president. That's the one I'm running for in 2024. Well, Brandon, as always, really appreciate you. ActionAid, both USA International, doing great work on all of this. As always, thanks for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Great to be on. Thank you.
Yeah, anytime Mia Motley speaks, Prime Minister of Barbados, anywhere at an international forum, I always want to hear it. She always keeps it real. And, we haven't seen the hit piece come yet, but anytime she gives a big speech at the UN or anywhere like that, there's always an obligatory article that comes out somewhat soon about how under her, reign or leadership, China has made all this investment into Barbados. And it's yes, they've built roads, provided electric buses, helped them build out their airport and tourism, but they're always trying to make it seem like some sinister thing or whatever, because you can't have a black woman from the Caribbean speaking with clarity about global leadership, of course. It must be that she's a Chinese puppet.
100%. It's the only way. Chinese, Russian, possibly Cuban.
Yeah, whoever the right combination of evil people is at the right moment. Well, speaking of the global relationship of forces, if you will, we want to turn to the G20 and its aftermath, which is all about that. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue the conversation by Vijay Prashad, who is the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute. Vijay, thank you so much for being back with us.
I was afraid you were going to say, speaking of Chinese puppets. And then go straight to me.
I don't know who I'd be talking to then. You're 100% independent.
I was really nervous about that, Eugene, because that was a setup that I wasn't anticipating. Yes, okay.
Well, the good news. The good news is whatever accusations that are made, at least it's because you're relevant, and that's what's important. They never come after you if you don't have anything good to say.
Well,
sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. Listen,
VJ, you'll have to forgive me. You'll have to forgive me, VJ. It's so late for me that I keep people are making fun of me in the comments. I yawned. I'm really sorry. I'm 7 hours ahead. It's very late for me. I'm getting back into the hang of doing this at night, but we did just have the G20, which is what you're on to talk about. So why don't you give us a little idea of what, I guess your overall summary analysis of what came out of this particular G20 meeting. I mean, there was of course certain things that happened, certain interactions that happened that were quite cartoonishly pleasing and funny in many ways, but also speak to a broader context of what this means as the global order changes.
Well, if you don't mind, let's go back to the origins of the G20, the group of 20 countries, because I feel that that gets neglected sometimes. In 1974, the Western states plus Japan came together to create the G7, the group of seven. Basically, they formed the G7 to attack the new international economic order, which had just passed in the UN General Assembly, which came from the non aligned states, given a lot of power by the oil weapon wielded in 1973. The group of seven, in fact, was a reaction to the arrival of a kind of anti colonial dynamic in many states in the United Nations. Well, Group of Seven went along from 1974 until about the global financial crisis in 2007, at which point the G7 countries, finding themselves really on the back foot, decided to welcome other states into a much bigger platform, the G20. The G7 countries went begging to China and India, asking them to provide liquidity into the world system, saying that, look, if you do this for us, then we're going to wrap up the G7 and establish the G20 as the effective executive of world affairs, to go around the United Nations General Assembly. Well, the G20 was born. Unfortunately, after the Western countries decided that they had weathered the storm of the financial crisis, they didn't close down the G7. The G7 represents 10% of the world's population. Important to recognize that, although controls 50% of the world's wealth. They didn't wrap up the G7, they keep it intact, but they also kept the G20 going as a kind of stepchild. So this was the G20 meeting in Bali, Indonesia. Not much came of it, to be honest with you. It didn't actually advance many of the major issues, the dilemmas of humanity that are plaguing the planet. On the other hand, some important things did happen. Perhaps the most important event at the G20 was that Xi Jinping of China met for many hours with Joe Biden of the United States. Now, this is very important because between the last real meeting of these two countries, United States and China, which took place really before the pandemic set in, before the last major meeting, there's been a great deal of tension. In fact, the United States has imposed a kind of tension-ridden new Cold War against China since President Obama was in the White House. It was important, therefore, for Xi Jinping and Biden to meet and effectively say, let's not pursue this Cold War situation. In fact, the Chinese don't have to pursue the Cold War situation because they didn't actually participate in it. It was entirely imposed by the United States. Very interestingly, also at the G7, Australia's relatively new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, also talked about how they cherish the relationship with China and so on. We saw just before the G20 meeting, a trilateral meeting of the United States, Joe Biden, the South Korean President Yoon, a man of the far right, and the Japanese Prime Minister, Mr. Kishida. The three of them met at the sidelines of the ASEAN meeting that happened just before, and also affirmed, while they talked in belligerent tones about China, they affirmed the need to, quote unquote, reset relations with China. I think what's happened is that whereas earlier in Obama, in Trump, and in Biden as well, there was this idea that you could sort of barrel headlong into the Chinese, intimidate the Chinese to basically withdraw the economic and technological advancements. There's a recognition now in Washington it's not going to happen. So Biden himself had to say, listen, we need to manage our competition. I don't understand what that phrase means, managed competition. Manage it in what way? The United States is getting outflanked by much of the Chinese economy. So I don't know what they mean by manage. But effectively, G20, interesting meeting. The Indonesian president took them all off to plant trees. Very important because he highlighted the plight of the mangrove forests in Indonesia. Important gesture. Mr. Biden almost fell into the mangrove swamp, was saved by the president of Indonesia, Jojo. But of course, Not much else, except, as I said, the important quote unquote reset, as the Australian press is calling it, of relations with China. I think that's the headline of the G20 meeting.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you raised that, because I think, one of the critical questions about these multilateral forums in this era, and of course the Ukraine issue was a big issue and ultimately didn't really come up, but I know there's a lot of insistence to try to come up with some statement, but is whether or not the tensions that exist in groups like the G20 are heralding sort of the decline of a unipolar world order. Is this the eclipse of the U.S. sort of aegis over the world now that Biden is having to take a step back from some of his aggressive bellicosity from before? And I mean, obviously there are changes happening around the world. There's no doubt about that. But I just wonder how you look at that. And of course, the next G20 presidency will be India. And I think that's also designed to show, having Indonesia than India, that there is more unity perhaps amongst the big countries of the world. Anyway, let me stop editorializing and get your thoughts there.
Well, the first thing is that certainly the United States is in a fragile position. I don't think the US State Department had any illusions that they could walk into the G20 meeting and have a statement come out there which condemned Russia. After all, Russia is a member of good standing of the G20. It's very unlikely that that would have happened. The worry was that no final statement would come out of the G20. That's what the Indonesians were privately talking about. Very worried that they were hosting the G20 meeting and there'd be no final statement. That would be a rebuke to their chairmanship. In fact, in the end, a statement was put out there, and I was very interested in the opening paragraph. In the opening paragraph of the Bali Declaration, there's a suggestion that the G20 effectively is not a place to adjudicate security issues. That was the direct statement in the opening paragraph, saying this is largely about trade, development, and so on. This is not about political matters such as stopping a war and so on. The G20 is just not that space. You want to deal with that? Go to the UN perhaps, or go to some other forum. I think that was an interesting compromise which everybody could accept, so that there was no attempt to either condemn the Russian invasion in Ukraine or to justify it. I mean, they just let it go because they had other things to talk about, including issues of the climate devastation and so on, which in fact I would say that there were more interesting things said at the G20 on this issue than at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, because there was actually a conversation about the question of climate financing among senior leaders. Anyway, I don't have much faith that this is going to advance much. As it is, they have had this loss and damage fund, which they announced out of Sharm el-Sheikh. It's basically a warmed over version of the Santiago initiative that was taken in the COP25 in 2019, that was held in Santiago, Chile, where they already came up with a loss and damage. It's so interesting how the major powers in the world recycle. If the only recycling that happens are these initiatives that are supposed to save the climate from destruction. So we see, obviously, in the G20, a sign that the United States can't impose its will on the rest of the world. Well, what's the alternative? I think too hastily, people are beginning to see a fragmentation of US power and the emergence of new poles and so on. I just don't see that happening. What I do see happening is an increased appetite for regionalism. And perhaps, and I'll come back to this, the emergence of the BRICS. But first on regionalism, I mentioned that the G7 just basically comprises 10% of the world's population, if you add up the population of the 7 countries. But the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, founded in 2001, comprises 40% of the world's population. Much larger percentage of the world's people belong to the SCO. Well, the SCO is nothing other than a kind of Asian bloc. It includes large Asian countries like China and India. In fact, it's really interesting that India is part of the SCO with China, because it also includes Pakistan, Iran, and so on. Russia. I mean, it is actually a considerable regional body. Lula is going to be inaugurated as the president of Brazil on the 1st of January 2023. Lula was the initiator of CELAC, the community of Latin American and Caribbean states. When I was in Brazil meeting with the Lula team, they said that while it'll be hard to move a genuine social democratic or even left agenda in Brazil internally, because the Congress is basically a right-wing Congress, Lula is going to spend a lot of energy on Latin American integration. In other words, regionalism. So I would just take these two examples of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization expanding, of CELAC, and the various movements to integrate South America and Latin America and the Caribbean. This is the direction in which we are going forward. No more single master, as a certain person said at the Munich security conference in 2007. I'll let your listeners guess who that certain person was. No more single master, but certainly greater regional development. Now, whether BRICS come back, that's another issue. But certainly BRICS is a pale shadow of the hope that was there in 2009.
It's very well said. And something else that was really interesting to me, kind of watching the news reports about the G20, was the fact that basically all these international financial institutions were warning that, like the global economic outlook looks so gloomy. It looks really gloomy. We just need to keep tightening our belts. And it's true. I think for these wealthy countries, the economic outlook does in fact look gloomy. And it's just interesting to see that they were so busy talking about Russia, they didn't even offer any ideas of how to deal with their own economic problems. I mean, Europe is facing I don't know if they might already be in one, or they're likely going to be in a recession. And while they've temporarily, fixed, or not temporarily, postponed the inevitable with having gas shortages by storing up enough for the wintertime, that's not going to last forever. They don't have alternatives in place. It kind of seems like these countries are almost either in denial or just kicking the can down the road.
Well, that's, quite correct. I'm not sure that they're in denial. I think they know exactly what's happening. And the reason we know that they know what's happening is that they've been saying so. I mean, they are in a serious, either short-term or medium-term problem. The sabotage of Nord Stream 2 is actually ruined one of the principal pieces of infrastructure that allowed Europe to get reasonably priced energy, and therefore not have to restart coal-fired plants in Germany or to restart nuclear in several countries and so on. The fact that Nord Stream was so badly damaged, I don't know how long it'll take to repair that pipeline, if the Russians or others are willing to repair it. Russia has found customers for its natural gas in China, in other countries in Asia, including India, of course, not natural gas, but oil. I don't know if they'll even bother to resupply the European economy. I'm not sure. It's a question European leaders should be asking themselves. They've basically priced themselves out of the market. There is a recession. It's already there. Already many countries have had third quarter growth rates go down, and that's a technical definition of a recession. This, of course, predates the Russian entry into Ukraine on the 24th of February of this year. It predates it. The recessionary pressure, in fact, predates the pandemic. In many countries, there was a possibility of recession even before the pandemic started. You already see this in 2019. So, yeah, I think they know what's going on, Rani. I don't think it's a lack of knowledge. I think their options are limited. Actually, if I'm to be quite clear, their options are limited. It's not even that they're burying their head in the sand, and the options are limited politically. Because politically, it's actually quite possible for the United States and others to initiate pressure on the Ukrainian government to come to the table with the Russians. You see, right now, the Russians and the Ukrainians could easily come up with a deal. I looked at Volodymyr Zelensky's 10-point plan that he put on the table. This actually resembles bits and pieces of Minsk II, which the Russians say they are committed to. In April of this year, Russia and Ukraine came to an interim agreement under the auspices of the Turks. There's space for an agreement between Ukraine and Russia. Unfortunately, the United States, UK, and other Western states are putting pressure not to allow a negotiation. So that actually reduces the political options for these countries. They are stuck with recession unless they are able to come to terms with the fact that Russia is a real country. It exists on the borders of Ukraine. It's going to have to remain there. Ukraine and Russia are going to have to come to terms with each other. They are permanent allies. I've said this before. Ukraine cannot be lifted out of its territory and plonked in the middle of the United States. It's going to have to live next to Russia. They're going to have to come to some terms. Well, until they come to some terms, the political options for France and Germany and Italy and so on are minuscule. They don't have any space of maneuver. They are trapped effectively in recession upon recession.
Well, Vijay, I'm so glad you brought out this issue of the options as well. And I mean, it almost feels like this existential desire to weaken Russia, weaken China, to prevent the sort of Eurasian thing coming together. I mean, I know as a materialist, I'm supposed to root everything in the current realities of capitalism, but it's hard not to think about how the biggest kind of evil boogeyman in Western sort of lexicon history is Genghis Khan. And, what did Genghis Khan do? We know certainly united Eurasia, not to the benefit of Europe. And it just feels like it's almost this existential, almost like suprafactual fear that exists about the possibility of greater Eurasian integration for these nations in the West that has trapped them in this myopic policy world.
Well, what's interesting about that is that the European Union, about 3 years ago, just before the pandemic, started discussing Eurasian integration. Now, we know that Eurasian integration in the contemporary period is a product of the world financial crisis and of the wars that the West prosecuted against Iraq, Iran, and Libya. Basically, they cut off Europe from perfectly decent sources of energy in North Africa and West Asia. And therefore, Europe, but particularly Germany, became more and more reliant upon Russian energy sources. That was one facet of integration. The second is after the financial crisis, Western capital essentially descended into the bowels of illicit tax havens. And it was Chinese capital that came to the table, which is why 17 Eastern European countries 17 European countries get involved one way or the other with the Belt and Road Initiative. It was a natural process as a consequence of these developments. Well, the European Union starts a discussion about 3 years ago about Eurasian integration. Now, what I find interesting is this is a time when there's a lot of pressure for European countries to stop allowing Huawei to provide 5G technology to European countries and so on. In the UK, in Germany, there was a big pressure from the United States. Don't allow Huawei in, they'll take away your privacy and so on. European Union released a study where they talked about Eurasian integration. So in fact, Eugene, what was interesting is the EU, the bureaucrats in Brussels had no problem with Eurasian integration. They had a problem with who they thought is calling the shots. In other words, a Eurasian integration dominated by Europe and behind Europe, United States and Canada is perfectly acceptable. If the G7 ran the integration, it was okay. In the same way as Russia was welcomed into the G7, for a while it was the G8 because Russia was a part of it. As long as Yeltsin and then Putin was subordinate to the G7 countries, Western Europe and North America, all was okay. So in fact, I was quite interested to find that they didn't have a problem with Eurasian integration per se. They had a problem with who was dominating it. And if it appeared as if in the driver's seat was China and Russia, then it was outrageous. If Europe was colonizing or recolonizing Russia and China, that was fine. So in fact, they don't have a principled objection to Eurasian integration. They have a principled objection to not being in charge and benefiting principally from that integration.
Well, there we go. That's the center of gravity on which everything else is orbiting around. As always, VJ bringing great clarity to the eddies and currents of all the global situation. And of course, Tricontinental dossiers and newsletters are required reading for anyone who really wants to follow this.
Yes.
But of course, VJ Prashad, Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute, thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Bye.
Of course. Well, Rania, that brings us roughly to a close here. One of the sadder times, perhaps, for you and I, but it has to be done. We can't just be on 24 hours a day, 365.
The close is the sadder time, yeah. I mean, I guess we could. If you guys wanted to like do some sort of fundraising campaign for that.
$1 million in the next 5 days.
$1 million. And we will do like a 24/7. I mean, sometimes people can stand in for us, right? Because like I have to sleep.
That's true. That's true.
But.
Someone could, or we could. I don't even know what we'll do about that. Shout out to the person also who's anonymous, but I saw you made a sizable donation there. You know who you are. Thank you very much for that.
Ooh, we have
at
sound effects now.
See, that's what happens when you donate, kids. You get sound effects.
Yeah. Or is it like a studio audience? That was like a real studio audience.
Of course, you
we
can
need
always
to get
go
a
to
camera so you can see them.
You can always go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news to become an ongoing patron. If all of our Twitter followers just gave us $2 a month, it'd be $1.8 million a year. Think about that when you go to patreon.com/breakthrough news, patreon.com/breakthrough news. And of course, be on the lookout for Dispatches with Rania Khalek. If you subscribed on YouTube and hit the bell, it'll look out for you. So just remember to subscribe and hit the bell. For myself, for the great Rania Khalek, for our whole team here at Breakthrough News, that's going to do it for us on the freedom side this week.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
Now, let me be clear.
We did it, Joe.